Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the vast darkness of the 41st millennium, where war defines existence and hope hangs by threads thinner than spider silk, there exists one world that stands above all others. Not because of its resources, though it possesses wealth beyond measure. Not because of its strategic position, though it sits at the heart of the galaxy-spanning Imperium. No, holy Terra matters because it is humanity's birthplace, the cradle from which mankind first reached for the stars, and the throne upon which sits the God Emperor himself, sustained in his golden prison for more than 10,000 years. Terra is not merely defended, it is fortified beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Layer upon layer of protection surrounds the ancient world, from orbital weapons platforms that could reduce whole fleets to vapor, to ground-based defenses that have stood vigil since before the Horus heresy itself. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own guardians, stand eternal watch over the Imperial Palace. These golden warriors are to Space Marines what Space Marines are to ordinary men, created through processes known only to the Emperor himself, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering that takes decades to complete. 10,000 strong, they are the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. Their reflexes so impossibly fast that bullets seem to bend away from them. Their skills so profound that a single custodian can hold ground against dozens of lesser foes. Yet for all this protection, for all the layers of adamantium and prayer, there exists a threat that has come closer than any other to bringing Terra to its knees. Not the forces of chaos, though they battered at the gates during the siege of Terra. Not the tyrannid hive fleets, though they hunger endlessly. No, the green-skin tide, that endless wave of brutal, cunning warriors who live only for battle, has proven capable of reaching humanity's holiest world. And should they come again, should the Orks mass in numbers sufficient to darken the stars themselves, the consequences would reshape the galaxy forever. This is the story of what happens when Orks invade Holy Terra. Not a tale of certain victory or noble sacrifice, but an exploration of brutal reality, where the oldest enemy of mankind meets the greatest fortress ever built, where faith collides with fungal fury, and where the very existence of the Imperium hangs in the balance. The greenskin menace is unlike any other threat humanity faces. To understand what makes an Ork invasion of Terra so catastrophic, we must first peer into the strange biology and psychology that defines these creatures. They are not born in the way humans understand birth. They do not grow in wombs or emerge helpless from eggs. Instead, Orks are fungi, a fact that seems almost comical until you grasp its terrible implications. The Orks are, at their most fundamental level, a fusion of animal and fungal biology, a symbiotic relationship engineered by the Old Ones more than 60 million years before humanity's first cities rose on Terra's surface. This ancient engineering created something that should not exist in nature, a living weapon system designed to fight wars that would span star systems and last for geological ages. The Old Ones, those mysterious beings who once shaped the galaxy according to their will, needed soldiers who could survive anywhere, who could replenish their numbers without complex supply chains, who would fight with endless enthusiasm no matter how long the conflict lasted. What they created was the Krork, the ancient predecessors of modern Orks. These original warriors were sophisticated, standing as tall as 12 meters in some cases, wielding technology that rivaled anything the Imperium produces today. But over millions of years, without the Old One's guidance, as the Krork fought endless battles across the dying galaxy, the species devolved. They became smaller, cruder, less technologically advanced. Yet paradoxically, they became more successful. The simpler Orks spread further, adapted better, survived catastrophes that would have eliminated their more refined ancestors. This evolutionary journey created a species perfectly optimized for one purpose: war. Every aspect of orc biology serves combat effectiveness. Their green skin is not merely coloration, but contains chlorophyll, allowing them to perform photosynthesis. This means that an orc can survive on minimal food, drawing energy directly from sunlight like a plant. In a siege situation, where other species would starve, orcs can endure almost indefinitely if they have access to light and water. Their blood is green too, thick with fungal organisms and high in chlorophyll content, with trace elements of carbon and copper. When an orc is wounded, this blood clots quickly, far faster than human blood, sealing wounds that would be fatal to lesser species. The fungal elements in their bloodstream actively work to repair damage, knitting flesh back together, regrowing lost tissue, allowing orcs to recover from injuries that should kill them. The internal structure of an orc reflects brutal efficiency. They lack many of the complex organs that humans possess. There is no liver performing its countless metabolic functions, no kidneys filtering waste, no complex immune system fighting off disease. Instead, the fungal aspects of their biology handle these tasks through simpler, more robust processes. This means that an orc has fewer critical organs that can be damaged, fewer points of failure that an enemy can exploit. Their skull is approximately 2 inches thick, far denser than human bone, capable of stopping bullets that would penetrate lesser protection. This allows orcs to literally headbutt their way through obstacles, to use their heads as weapons in close combat, to survive impacts that would kill through skull fracture alone. Their jaws are powerful enough to bite through metal. Their tusks capable of goring enemies who get too close. The muscular system is equally impressive. An orc can lift weights that would require specialized equipment for humans to manage. They can tear through barricades, rip open vehicle hatches, crush bones with their bare hands. This strength is not the bulky, slow power of someone who has merely built muscle mass, but rather a quick, explosive force that allows orcs to move with surprising speed despite their size. Their senses are optimized for combat rather than subtle perception. Orc eyes see motion extremely well, tracking fast-moving targets with ease, but they have difficulty with fine details. Their hearing picks up the sounds of battle, gunfire and explosions and screams, but they struggle with quiet whispers or subtle audio cues. Smell and taste are crude by human standards, serving mainly to distinguish food from non-food, friend from foe. Pain tolerance in orcs goes beyond what other species experience. They feel pain, but it does not slow them down in the way it would a human. An orc with a severed limb will often keep fighting, using the stump as a club, laughing at the injury because it makes the fight more interesting. They can be shot multiple times, stabbed, burned, and continue advancing as if these were minor inconveniences rather than life-threatening wounds. This resilience extends to environmental hazards. Orcs have been found surviving in conditions that would kill other species within minutes. They thrive in toxic environments, their robust biology shrugging off poisons that would melt human tissue. They endure temperature extremes, functioning in freezing cold or burning heat with minimal discomfort. They have even been documented surviving in the vacuum of space for brief periods, their fungal components keeping them alive long enough to reach safety. The regenerative capabilities are perhaps most disturbing to Imperial observers. Wounds that would cripple a human permanently are merely temporary setbacks for orcs. Lost fingers regrow within weeks. Damaged organs repair themselves. Even severed limbs can be reattached if found quickly enough, the fungal biology knitting the parts back together. There are documented cases of orcs being decapitated, having their heads sewn back on by painboy surgeons, and returning to combat with no apparent ill effects beyond some scarring. This ability to heal makes killing orcs definitively a challenge. The standard Imperial doctrine is massive overkill, shooting until the target is reduced to component parts, burning the remains, then burning them again to be sure. Anything less risks the orc recovering and returning to battle. There are horror stories of greenskins found in battlefield salvage piles, thought to be corpses, suddenly reviving when something wakes them, attacking the salvage crews with whatever weapons come to hand. Every orc, from the moment it begins to exist until the second it finally falls in battle, constantly releases microscopic spores into the environment around it. These spores drift on air currents, settle into soil, embed themselves in cracks in walls and floors. They are nearly invisible, incredibly resilient, and utterly persistent. When an orc dies, particularly in the heat of battle, it releases a final massive cloud of these reproductive elements, seeding the ground where it fell, with the potential for thousands more greenskins. The spores themselves are marvels of biological engineering, though calling them purely biological misses their true nature. Each spore contains within it the genetic template not just for orcs, but for the entire orcoid ecosystem. They are information packages wrapped in nearly indestructible organic shells, capable of surviving conditions that would sterilize other reproductive cells. Extreme temperatures, whether freezing or burning, merely cause them to go dormant rather than die. Radiation that would shred ordinary DNA leaves orc spores intact. Chemical weapons designed to denature proteins and dissolve cell walls find these spores frustratingly resistant. The dispersal mechanism is brutally efficient. Living orcs constantly shed spores from their skin, releasing them with every breath, leaving trails of potential infestation wherever they walk. When they engage in physical activity, when they fight or run or simply exert themselves, the spore release increases dramatically. A single orc in combat can release millions of spores per hour, creating an invisible cloud of contamination around any battlefield. But it is in death that an orc truly sows the seeds of future invasions. When greenskin biology fails, when damage finally overwhelms even their robust healing systems, a triggered response activates in the dying moments. The orc's body undergoes rapid decomposition, far faster than would occur naturally, as the fungal aspects consume the animal parts. This process releases a final spore burst, a concentrated cloud containing perhaps billions of individual spores, all dispersing from the decomposing corpse. These death spores are distributed by whatever forces are available. Wind carries them across landscapes. Water disperses them through drainage systems. Animals and vehicles pick them up on feet and treads, transporting them to new locations. Some spores are so light they can remain airborne for days, drifting hundreds of kilometers from their origin point before finally settling. Once settled, the spores enter a dormant phase. They can remain in this state for years, decades, even centuries, waiting for conditions favorable to germination. Temperature, moisture, and the presence of organic matter all factor into when germination occurs. But the most important trigger is the absence of other orcs. The spores seem to possess some form of chemical awareness, detecting pheromones or other signals from living greenskins. While adult orcs are present in an area, the spores often remain dormant, avoiding competition. But when the adults depart or die off, when the chemical signals fade, germination begins. The germination process itself is alien to human reproductive biology. The spore does not grow into an infant that must be cared for and protected. Instead, it forms a structure underground, a fungal mass that imperial xenobiologists call the womb bloom. This structure draws nutrients from the surrounding soil, growing larger over weeks or months, developing specialized chambers within its bulk. Within these chambers, the various orcoid species develop simultaneously. The genetic information in the original spore unfolds in a carefully orchestrated sequence, creating first the simplest organisms and progressing toward the most complex. Squigs emerge first, small fungal creatures that serve as the foundation of the greenskin food chain. These come in dozens of varieties, from the tiny paint squigs that orcs use for coloring their equipment, to the massive attack squigs that can be ridden into battle. As the squigs begin to multiply and spread through the local environment, the next stage activates. Snotlings emerge from the womb bloom, diminutive creatures with just enough intelligence to tend fungal gardens and perform simple tasks. They gather the squigs, they cultivate additional fungi for food, they create the basic infrastructure that will support the larger species to come. With the ecosystem foundation established, Gretchen appear. These creatures, larger than snotlings but still much smaller than true orcs, possess genuine cunning and a crude intelligence that allows them to build structures, operate simple machinery, and organize basic societies. They create the settlements where orcs will eventually live. They construct the workshops where equipment will be repaired. They establish the supply systems that will keep the warband functional. Only after all this preparation, after the ecosystem is established and functioning, do the orcs themselves emerge. They dig their way out of the ground already full-sized, already possessing instinctive knowledge of how to fight, how to survive, how to organize themselves into the brutal hierarchy that governs greenskin society. These feral orcs might be smaller than their spacecraft-riding cousins, might lack the sophisticated equipment of a proper warband, but they are no less dangerous for it. What follows is a rapid multiplication. The newly emerged orcs immediately begin fighting among themselves, establishing dominance, creating the pecking order that will determine leadership. As they fight, they grow, their biology responding to combat stress by accelerating development. The biggest and strongest become knobs, natural leaders who command through physical superiority. The cunning ones, those with more brains than brawn, become specialists, learning through genetic memory how to build weapons, repair equipment, tend to wounds. Within months, a single spore contamination can become a thriving greenskin settlement. Within years, that settlement can grow into a proper warband numbering thousands. Within decades, an entire continent could be overrun with orc tribes, all descended from spores left behind by a battle fought generations earlier. This is why the Ordo Xenos treats orc contamination with such severity, why the recommended response to confirmed spore infestation on Imperial worlds is often complete exterminatus. The spores do not immediately become orcs. Instead, they create an entire ecosystem, a moving, breathing support structure that sustains the greenskin war machine. First come the squigs, squirming fungal creatures that serve as food and occasionally as living weapons. Then emerge the snotlings, tiny creatures with rudimentary intelligence who tend the fungal gardens and maintain the basic infrastructure. Next arrive the Gretchen, called grots by their larger cousins, clever and cowardly beings who build the settlements and perform the labor too tedious for proper orcs. Only after this foundation is established do the orcs themselves emerge from the ground, already larger than a man, already bearing instinctive knowledge of how to fight, how to build crude weapons, how to organize into mobs and tribes. This reproductive cycle creates a horror that defenders of human worlds know all too well. You cannot simply defeat an orc invasion and move on. Even if every single greenskin is killed, even if their bodies are burned and their war machines reduced to slag, the spores remain. Decades later, sometimes centuries later, feral orc tribes will emerge from the wilderness, growing from those ancient seeds of war, forcing humanity to fight the same battle again and again. The only true solution is exterminatus, the total obliteration of a world's biosphere, a cure so extreme that it destroys everything you fought to save. On Terra, with its quadrillions of inhabitants, its countless holy sites, its irreplaceable artifacts from before the age of strife, exterminatus is unthinkable. Should orc spores take root in the soil of humanity's birth world, the contamination would be permanent, an infection that would require eternal vigilance to contain. But the spores are only part of what makes orcs so dangerous. The greenskins possess something that defies conventional understanding, a collective psychic power that grows stronger with their numbers. Imperial scholars call it the Gestalt field, though the orcs themselves simply know it as the joy of a proper fight. When orcs gather in sufficient numbers, reality itself begins to bend to their expectations. Paint a vehicle red, and the Orks believe it goes faster. Because they believe it. Because thousands upon thousands of greenskin minds are convinced of this truth. The vehicle actually does go faster. Physics yields to faith, to collective will, to the sheer psychic weight of massed Orkoid consciousness. This field does more than make their ramshackle technology function. It creates a feedback loop that draws more Orks to the battle. The bigger the fight, the stronger the Gestalt field becomes. The stronger the field, the more Orks it attracts. A small warband can grow into a massive horde in a matter of weeks, as greenskins from across a sector feel the pull of gathering numbers and rush to join the carnage. Left unchecked, this snowball effect can result in forces numbering in the billions, armies so vast they can darken the skies of entire worlds. Ork psychology is equally alien and equally terrifying. They do not fight for territory, though they claim it. They do not fight for resources, though they take them. They do not fight because they hate their enemies or fear for their survival. Orks fight because fighting is what they were created to do, because battle brings them a joy that other species can barely comprehend. To an Ork, warfare is not a necessary evil or a tragic burden. It is the point of existence itself, the highest form of pleasure, the ultimate expression of what it means to be alive. This means you cannot negotiate with them, cannot offer them something better than war, cannot appeal to their desire for peace, because that desire simply does not exist. An Ork would rather die in glorious combat than live in comfortable safety. They would rather lose a battle spectacularly than win through cowardly tactics. They respect strength and cunning, but only as means to achieve more and better fighting. Their society reflects this obsession. The biggest Ork rules, period. Size equals power equals authority. When an Ork grows large enough and tough enough to best all challengers, it becomes a war boss, and other Orks follow not out of loyalty or ideology, but because following the biggest boss means finding the best fights. These war bosses can unify entire planets under their rule, not through careful diplomacy or political maneuvering, but simply by being too large and powerful for anyone to challenge successfully. When a war boss becomes particularly successful, when it conquers world after world and its legend spreads, something even more dangerous occurs. The Great Crusade begins, that terrible migration that the Imperium has learned to fear above almost all else. Millions of Orks, drawn by the psychic beacon of success, converge on the war boss's location. They come in their ramshackle ships, their space hulks cobbled together from a dozen different vessels, their crude but effective war machines. They come ready for the greatest fight the galaxy has to offer, and they will not stop until every enemy is dead, or they themselves have fallen. Terra has faced such a crusade once before. The memory of it still haunts Imperial records, still appears in the nightmares of those who study Xenos threats. It was called the War of the Beast, and it came within a hair's breadth of destroying everything humanity had built. Holy Terra sits wrapped in defenses that have been accumulating for more than 10 millennia. To assault it is to face not merely an army or even a fleet, but the concentrated military might of an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds. Yet these defenses are not invincible. They have been tested before, and understanding what protects Terra helps us grasp both the magnitude of what an Ork invasion must overcome and the catastrophe that would unfold should those defenses fail. The first line of defense exists far beyond Terra itself, in the void between stars. The Segmentum Solar is patrolled by Battlefleet Solar, the largest concentration of Imperial Navy vessels anywhere in the galaxy. Thousands of warships, from nimble escorts to massive battleships kilometers in length, stand ready to intercept any threat long before it reaches the Sol system. These are not the outdated vessels or second-hand cruisers that defend frontier worlds. These are the finest ships the Imperium can build, crewed by sailors whose families have served aboard them for generations, commanded by admirals whose tactical expertise is legendary. Should any enemy somehow penetrate this outer cordon, they face the Sol system's inner defenses. Luna, Terra's ancient moon, has been converted into a fortress whose surface bristles with weapon batteries capable of reducing entire fleets to debris. Mars, the red planet home to the Adeptus Mechanicus, contributes its own fleet, along with Titan legions ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The outer planets host monitoring stations and defensive installations, each one a miniature fortress in its own right. Then there is the Phalanx, the mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, one of the most powerful vessels ever constructed by human hands. When it patrols the Sol system, as it often does, it serves as a deterrent so potent that merely its presence can give pause to would-be invaders. The Phalanx alone could engage an entire enemy fleet and expect to emerge victorious. But assume, for the sake of this exploration, that all these defenses are bypassed or overwhelmed. Assume the Orks arrive in such numbers that even Battlefleet Solar cannot stop them all. That enough green-skinned ships survive the gauntlet to reach Terra itself. What then awaits them? Terra's orbital space is a maze of defensive platforms, weapons satellites, and monitoring stations. Every approach vector is covered by overlapping fields of fire. Macro cannons that could level cities track potential threats. Lance batteries capable of burning through meters of armor stand ready to fire. Nova cannons, the most powerful weapons in the Imperial arsenal short of cyclonic torpedoes, can obliterate enemy vessels in single shots. This orbital defense grid has stood for thousands of years, maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus with religious devotion, tested regularly to ensure no weakness exists in its coverage. Should the Orks somehow survive this gauntlet and make landing on Terra's surface, they face the planet itself. Terra is not one fortress, but millions. A world where every hive city is designed to be defended, where every district has its bunkers and strongpoints, where the entire population has been drilled in what to do when invasion comes. The planet's surface is crisscrossed with defense lines, some dating back to the Unification Wars when the Emperor first brought Terra under his rule. But the true heart of Terra's defense is the Imperial Palace. To call it a palace is to call an ocean a puddle. The Imperial Palace is a continent-sized complex of fortifications, temples, administrative centers, and barracks. Its outer walls rise hundreds of meters high, built of adamantium and blessed by millennia of prayer. Its gates can withstand orbital bombardment. Its towers house weapons that can engage targets in low orbit. The entire structure is a maze of kill zones and choke points designed by Rogel Dawn himself during the preparations for the Siege of Terra, refined and strengthened over 10,000 years of paranoid improvement. The palace is not a single structure, but rather thousands of interconnected buildings, walls, and fortifications that have grown together over the millennia like a coral reef of stone and metal. When Rogel Dawn first began fortifying the palace during the preparations for the Horus heresy, he worked with a blank canvas, transforming what had been an impressive but ultimately decorative complex into the greatest fortress humanity had ever constructed. He tore down ceremonial wings and replaced them with bastions. He filled ornamental gardens with bunkers and fighting positions. He turned every approach into a killing ground where attackers would die in their thousands before reaching the walls. But that was only the beginning. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, successive generations of engineers and architects have continued Dawn's work. Every High Lord who feared for Terra's safety added their own contributions. Every military crisis prompted new construction. Every technological advance was incorporated into the defenses. The result is a fortress that has evolved like a living organism, each generation adding new layers, while the old structures remain buried beneath, creating a three-dimensional maze of incredible complexity. The outer walls alone are a wonder of military architecture. They stretch for hundreds of kilometers, encircling the palace proper and its immediate surroundings. These walls stand taller than many hive spires, their surfaces sloped at angles designed to deflect incoming fire and prevent easy scaling. The adamantium armor plating that sheathes them is meters thick, reinforced by force fields and void shields that can absorb tremendous punishment before failing. Built into these walls are thousands of weapon emplacements. Lance batteries capable of striking targets in orbit point skyward from reinforced turrets. Macro cannons that could level cities' track inward and outward, ready to engage ground or aerial targets. Automated bolter turrets, each one capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously, cover every approach with overlapping fields of fire. Heavy flamers stand ready to drench any attackers who reach the walls in Prometheum, turning scaling attempts into funeral pyres. The gates are massive structures in their own right, each one large enough to allow the passage of Titan-class war machines. They are constructed of layer upon layer of different materials, each chosen to defend against specific threats. The outermost layer is ceramite, ablative armor designed to dissipate energy weapons. Behind that sits plasteel, resistant to kinetic impacts. Then adamantium for structural strength. Each gate is so heavy it requires plasma generators to provide power for opening and closing, processes that take hours to complete when the palace is sealed for war.
You know, when I first learned about the War of the Beasts years ago, I thought it was almost ridiculous how close the Orks actually came to winning. But the more I've researched for this video, the more I realize how terrifying it really is. We always think of Orks as comic relief in Warhammer, right? The funny green skins who believe red makes things go faster, but when you actually dig into what happened during the Beast invasion, when you see the Imperium nearly collapsed, it stops being funny. That attack moon hanging over Terra, the High Lords panicking, entire Space Marines chapters wiped out. Sometimes I wonder if the Imperium got lucky or if the Beast just made one critical mistake. Either way, I genuinely don't think the Imperium could survive if it happened again. Anyways, back to the story.
Between the outer walls and the inner palace lie killing fields designed with terrible purpose. These are not open spaces, but carefully engineered terrain where every rock, every depression, every apparent piece of cover serves the defenders. What looks like a natural boulder is actually a reinforced bunker with firing slits. What seems like a sheltered hollow is actually a pre-targeted kill zone where artillery fire will concentrate. The ground itself is mined, not with obvious explosive devices that can be detected and avoided, but with sophisticated weapons that wait silently for specific triggering conditions. The inner palace, where the greatest treasures of humanity are housed, rises from this deadly landscape like a mountain of gold and stone. Its architecture defies easy description, a fusion of countless styles accumulated over millennia, from the brutal functionalism of Dawn's original fortifications to the soaring Gothic splendor added during the ages of apostasy and redemption. Spires reach into the clouds, each one a fortress in its own right, capable of independent operation if the rest of the complex falls. The palace grounds host structures whose purposes are known only to those who serve within them. There are barracks for the custodian guard, training halls where the emperor's chosen warriors perfect their already superhuman skills. There are chapels and cathedrals where prayers have been offered continuously for 10,000 years. There are administrative wings where bureaucrats manage the affairs of a million worlds. There are workshops where the finest craftsmen create war gear and artwork to glorify the emperor. Deep beneath the surface, carved into the living rock of Terra itself, lie the palace's deepest secrets. The dungeons hold prisoners whose crimes were so severe that even death was considered too merciful a punishment. The treasuries contain artifacts from before the age of strife, technology so dangerous or so precious that it cannot be risked in the wider galaxy. The archives preserve records that span human history, from the first settlements on Terra to the present day. And at the very heart of this vast complex, protected by walls within walls, guarded by the finest warriors humanity can produce, sustained by technology that few understand and none can replicate, sits the Golden Throne. Here rests the Emperor of mankind, neither living nor dead, sustained in his endless vigil by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily, his consciousness holding together an empire spanning the stars, while his body remains imprisoned in its golden shell. The approaches to the throne room are limited and heavily defended. There is the Eternity Gate, a massive portal that leads through a mile-long corridor lined with the banners of humanity's greatest heroes. This corridor alone could serve as a fortress, with murder holes in the ceiling, blast doors capable of sealing it into segments, and defensive positions from which even a handful of defenders could hold against vast numbers. Around the throne room itself stand 300 custodians, the companions, who never leave their posts. They stand eternal watch, guardians who will defend the Emperor with their lives, who will fight until their last breath leaves them, who represent the final line of defense against any who would threaten their lord. Within the palace dwell the Adeptus Custodes, 10,000 golden guardians who have stood vigil over the Emperor since before the Imperium existed. Each custodian is worth 100 space marines, and that is not hyperbole. They are faster, stronger, more skilled, and possess equipment that makes even Astartes' wargear look crude. Their guardian spears can cut through power armor like parchment. Their auramite armor can turn aside blows that would destroy lesser protection. They have trained for centuries, sometimes millennia, perfecting martial arts that turn them into weapons more precise than any blade. The Custodes do not fight like space marines. Where Astartes are warriors trained to operate as part of a unit, each custodian is an army unto himself. They fight with a fluid grace that belies their size, each movement economical and deadly, wasting no energy, making no unnecessary actions. They can read a battlefield with glances, predict enemy movements before they occur, adapt their tactics in microseconds. Against ordinary foes, a single custodian can hold ground that would require a company of space marines. Against orcs, even orcs, they are death incarnate. Beyond the Custodes, Terra hosts other defenders. The Inquisition maintains strongholds on the Holy World, and while Inquisitors themselves are not primarily warriors, they command resources that include some of humanity's deadliest operatives. The Officio Assassinorum has temples on Terra, and though assassins work alone, their presence means that orc warbosses would face threats that could eliminate them without warning, disrupting the greenskin command structure. The Grey Knights, that secretive chapter of space marines who specialize in fighting demons, maintain a fortress on Titan, one of Saturn's moons. While their primary purpose is combating the forces of chaos, they would certainly deploy should Terra itself face invasion. The Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's enforcers of law, have their headquarters on Terra and could mobilize millions of heavily armed officers. The Sisters of Battle maintain convents on the Holy World, thousands of power-armored warrior nuns, whose faith is as much a weapon as their bolters. The various Space Marine chapters might not maintain permanent garrison on Terra, but dozens of them would recall their forces to defend humanity's birth world should it come under serious threat. All of this represents just the military defenders. Terra's civilian population, numbering in the quadrillions, includes billions who have received at least basic military training. The Administratum could mobilize mass conscript armies on a scale that staggers imagination. Every hive spire has its defense force, every district has its militia. Even the countless pilgrims who flock to Terra, seeking to glimpse the site where the Emperor walked, include many former soldiers who would take up arms again to defend the holy ground. Yet despite all this, despite defenses that seem impregnable, Terra has been threatened before, and that threat came from Orks. Approximately 1,300 years after the Horus Heresy, during what Imperial records call the War of the Beast, the greatest greenskin threat in history emerged from the darkness. It began as Orc invasions often do, with raids on outlying worlds, small warbands testing human defenses. But these raids were different. The Orcs involved were larger than normal, more organized, more technologically advanced. They carried weapons that functioned too well, employed tactics too sophisticated for typical greenskins. As Imperial forces responded to these incursions, they discovered something terrifying. These were not scattered tribes operating independently. They were coordinated, part of a larger strategy, directed by intelligence that greenskins supposedly did not possess. Behind these raids stood something unprecedented. A warlord the Imperium came to call simply the Beast. The Beast was not a single entity, but rather 6 massive Ork warlords, each one a prime Ork of staggering size and intelligence. These beings stood as tall as hab blocks, dwarfing even the largest normal Orks. They spoke perfect High Gothic, understanding human culture and psychology well enough to exploit it. They commanded forces numbering in the billions, unified in a way Orks had not been since the ancient Ullanor Crusade during the Great Crusade itself. What made the Beast's crusade so devastating was not just its size, but its technology. The Orks wielded weapons that surpassed Imperial equivalents, including gravity-based armaments of incredible power. Most terrifying of all were the attack moons, planetoids hollowed out and converted into massive war stations, capable of faster-than-light travel through something the Mechanicus termed subspace, a hyperdimensional realm distinct from the warp. These attack moons were mobile fortresses, the size of small planets. Their surfaces were covered in armor plating so thick that conventional weapons could barely scratch it. They could open massive portals through which poured endless streams of Ork ships and warriors. Each attack moon was a nightmare made real, a weapon platform that could devastate entire star systems. The War of the Beast spread across the Imperium like wildfire. Segmentum after segmentum fell under assault. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters were forced into defensive positions around Ultramar. The Space Wolves, Salamanders, and Raven Guard became bogged down in their own campaigns, unable to reinforce other fronts. Even as the Imperium struggled to coordinate a response, the greenskin tide kept coming, kept growing, kept winning. And then an attack moon appeared in orbit over Terra itself. The arrival caused immediate chaos. The gravitational disturbances alone triggered earthquakes and tidal disruptions. But worse was the psychological impact. Terra had not faced direct assault since the siege, not for over a millennium. The population erupted into panic. Riots broke out as millions tried to flee or find shelter. The Adeptus Arbites struggled to maintain order as social structure began to collapse under the weight of fear. The High Lords of Terra, those 12 masters who governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name, found themselves paralyzed by political infighting, even as the existential threat loomed overhead. The Fabricator General of Mars initially refused to provide aid, pursuing his own agenda. Different factions pushed competing strategies, each convinced their approach was correct, while the Ork moon hung in the sky like a promise of doom. What followed was desperate improvisation on a scale the Imperium had not seen in generations. The Imperial Fists, humanity's greatest masters of defense, had been all but annihilated in earlier battles with the Beast. Only one member of the chapter remained, a captain named Corland, who became the last son of Rogel Dawn. He took command of the defense, rallying the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists in an unprecedented coalition. The Imperium attempted to destroy the attack moon through conventional means and failed. They tried teleporting it away using reverse-engineered Ork technology. The attempt went catastrophically wrong. Half the moon vanished into subspace, but the other half shattered, raining debris down on Terra's surface. Hundreds of millions died as chunks of the destroyed moon impacted populated areas. The Imperial Palace itself sustained damage. Ancient structures that had stood since before the heresy reduced to rubble. In desperation, elements within the High Lords authorized what became known as the Proletarian Crusade. Millions of civilians, convinced they could overwhelm the Orks through sheer numbers and faith, boarded whatever craft they could find and launched toward the remaining portion of the attack moon. What followed was slaughter on an unimaginable scale. The Orks manipulated the moon's surface, causing the very ground beneath the Crusaders' feet to shift and crush them. The entire army, millions strong, was annihilated in minutes. The war dragged on for months, draining Imperial resources, killing billions, pushing the Imperium toward the brink of collapse. The Space Marine chapters were devastated. their numbers reduced to levels not seen since the Horus heresy. Entire sectors fell to greenskin control. The Imperium's economy buckled under the strain of total war across dozens of active fronts simultaneously. Victory came only when Imperial forces, led by the returned Primarch Vulcan, assaulted Olenor itself, the beast's homeworld. There, in brutal close combat, Vulcan destroyed the largest of the beast prime orcs, though at terrible cost. The death of this central leader caused the Greenskin Crusade to fragment, the unity that had made them so dangerous dissolving back into typical orc squabbling. But the damage was done. The War of the Beast killed more Imperial citizens than any conflict since the heresy. It exposed critical weaknesses in the Imperium's defenses and political structure. It demonstrated that even Terra could be threatened, that the impossible was merely difficult. And it left a question that still haunts Imperial strategists. What happens if the Orks try again, with lessons learned from their failure? To understand what a modern Orc invasion of Terra would look like, we must imagine the opening moves, the terrible first hours when greenskin forces make planetfall on humanity's holiest world. The scenario requires us to assume conditions that make such an invasion possible. Perhaps the Orcs achieve strategic surprise, or they come in such overwhelming numbers that even Terra's defenses cannot stop them all, or some catastrophic failure creates a gap in the defensive perimeter. The first wave would not arrive as a coordinated military operation. Orcs do not think that way. Instead, individual war bosses, each commanding their own warband, would rush toward Terra in a race to be first into battle, to claim the greatest glory, to prove themselves the strongest. This lack of coordination is simultaneously the Orcs' greatest weakness and, paradoxically, one of their strengths. Human defenders preparing to counter a unified assault would instead face dozens of separate incursions happening simultaneously across the globe. Some Orc ships would burn up in Terra's atmosphere, their crude construction unable to survive atmospheric entry. Others would crash land, their pilots more concerned with getting to the fight quickly than surviving the landing. Still others would deploy via orbital insertion, Orcs simply leaping from their spacecraft in high orbit. Protected by nothing but their natural toughness and whatever scrap armor they happened to be wearing. Most would die. The Orcs would not care. Those who survived would be the toughest, the luckiest, the strongest. Natural selection in its most brutal form. The initial landing sites would be scattered across Terra's surface. Some Orcs would aim for the Imperial Palace itself, drawn by its obvious importance and the promise of the best fighting. They would slam into the palace's outer defenses, their assault ramps dropping even before their spacecraft finished skidding to a halt, greenskins pouring out with weapons blazing. The palace's automated defenses would activate immediately, turrets tracking targets, mines detonating, layers of overlapping fire tearing into the Orc ranks. But other warbands would land in the hive cities, in the industrial zones, in the vast pilgrimage routes that crisscross the planet. Some would crash into the irradiated wastelands that still scar portions of Terra from ancient wars. Each landing would create its own crisis, its own battle, forcing Imperial commanders to divide their attention across 100 fronts simultaneously. The Orcs' biology would begin working against Terra immediately. Every greenskin that died in those first brutal minutes would release its spores, invisible seeds spreading through the air, settling into cracks in the ancient ground. Within Terra's hive cities, where miles of undercity and abandoned infrastructure lurk beneath the inhabited levels, these spores would find perfect growing conditions: darkness, moisture, isolation from Imperial authorities. The initial Imperial response would be overwhelming force. In the hive cities, local defense forces would mobilize within minutes. These would not be the poorly equipped PDF forces of frontier worlds. Terra's defenders have access to the best equipment the Imperium can provide, training that spans years, and the motivation that comes from defending not just their homes, but the holiest site in human space. They would meet the Ork assault with disciplined volleys of laser gun fire, heavy weapons teams deploying to choke points, armored vehicles rumbling into position. At the Imperial Palace, the response would be even more dramatic. The Adeptus Custodes would deploy from the palace's depths, golden warriors moving with purpose and precision. Each custodian would head toward the sectors where Ork presence was heaviest. Their guardian spears already activated, their minds calculating trajectories and optimal engagement ranges. Unlike Space Marines, who often work in squads, the Custodes would operate as individuals or in small groups, each one capable of holding entire sectors against greenskin assault. The first clashes would be brutal and one-sided. Custodians move faster than the human eye can follow, their reflexes enhanced beyond what even Space Marine augmentation can achieve. An Ork mob charging toward the palace walls would find itself cut down before it understood what was happening. Golden blades moving through greenskin ranks like a scythe through wheat. The custodians would not be reckless or wasteful. Each movement would be precise, economical, perfectly calculated to achieve maximum lethality with minimum effort. But weight of numbers matters, even against demigods in golden armor. For every Ork that falls, more are landing, more are charging forward, drawn by the sounds of battle and the promise of a proper fight. The Gestalt field would begin to build. That psychic pressure that makes Orks stronger and more dangerous when they gather in sufficient numbers. Technology that should not work would start functioning. Ramshackle vehicles would roar to life. Guns that were empty moments before would somehow still be firing. The Orks would not employ subtle tactics or careful strategy. They would simply keep coming, wave after wave, accepting horrific casualties, because casualties mean nothing to creatures who view death in battle as the best possible end. Human defenders would find themselves exhausted by the sheer relentlessness of it. By fighting enemies who do not retreat, do not surrender, do not know fear. In the hive cities, the fighting would quickly become brutal urban warfare. Orks would surge through the streets, looting as they go, picking up weapons from fallen defenders and enemies alike. They would crash through buildings rather than going around them, their natural strength allowing them to simply smash through walls that would stop normal infantry. They would climb hive spires, their powerful limbs letting them scale surfaces that humans would need climbing gear to attempt. The civilian population would become a massive complication. Quadrillions of people cannot simply be evacuated, cannot be hidden away until the battle ends. Many would become casualties, caught between Ork attackers and desperate human defenders. Others would take up arms themselves, driven by faith or rage or simple survival instinct. This would create chaotic conditions where distinguishing friend from foe becomes difficult, where collateral damage becomes inevitable. The Orks would love every second of it. This would be exactly the kind of fight they exist for. Desperate, brutal, with worthy opponents who actually fight back. They would grow literally larger as the battle progressed, their biology responding to the stress and excitement of combat by accelerating growth. The war bosses leading these assaults would swell in size, becoming even more dangerous as the fighting intensified. But here is the critical point, often missed when considering Ork invasions. They do not need to win strategically to achieve victory tactically. Every minute the Orks spend on Terra's surface, they are releasing spores. Every battle, every death, every celebration of a particularly good scrap seeds the ground with future generations. Even if the Imperium successfully repels the initial invasion, even if every single Ork is eventually killed, the contamination would remain. This brings us to perhaps the most insidious aspect of an Ork invasion of Terra, the spore problem. Understanding this biological reality is crucial to grasping why Ork invasions are so fundamentally different from other threats the Imperium faces. When an Ork warband is defeated, when the last greenskin falls and defenders can finally rest, the battle has not truly ended. It has merely entered a new phase, one that will last for years, possibly centuries. Those microscopic spores that the Orks release throughout their time on-world have already begun their work, settling into the environment, beginning the slow process of creating the Orkoid ecosystem. On a normal world, a frontier planet with limited population, the solution is straightforward if brutal. Designate the contaminated areas as quarantine zones. Deploy kill teams to scour the landscape, burning everything, sterilizing the soil with chemical weapons, hunting down any Orkoid lifeforms that emerge. It is a process that can take decades, that requires constant vigilance, but it is manageable. On Terra, such an approach is impossible. How do you quarantine continent-sized hive cities? How do you sterilize soil that has been built over, paved over, buried under millennia of construction? Terra is not a single environment, but millions of nested environments, from the towering hive spires reaching into the thin atmosphere, to the deep underhives where sunlight has not penetrated in thousands of years, to the countless abandoned tunnels and chambers that riddle the planet's crust like a termite mound. The spores would find their way into these forgotten places. They would settle in the darkness of the underhives, where moisture drips from ancient pipes and warmth rises from the lower levels. There, invisible to the authorities above, the Orkoid life cycle would begin. Squigs would emerge first, small fungal creatures that could survive on the detritus of the underhive, multiplying in the darkness. Then would come the snotlings, then the Gretchen, building their crude settlements in abandoned hab blocks and forgotten industrial sectors. By the time the first feral Orks emerged from the ground, months or years might have passed since the initial invasion. These would not be the sophisticated greenskins of the initial assault, but savage creatures operating on pure instinct, smaller and weaker than their progenitors, but no less dangerous for it. They would attack underhive settlements, raiding for weapons and supplies, growing larger with each victory. The authorities would eventually notice something was wrong. Reports would filter up from the underhives of greenskin attacks, of strange creatures lurking in the abandoned levels. The initial response would likely be to dispatch local enforcers, Arbeits teams trained for urban pacification. These teams would discover that killing Orks in the confined spaces of the underhive is entirely different from fighting them in open terrain. The Orks would know these tunnels as well as anyone, perhaps better, their savage cunning allowing them to set ambushes and traps. They would adapt to their environment, learning where the defenders patrol, where weaknesses exist in the underhive's security. Each engagement, win or lose, would spread more spores, seeding adjacent sectors with new infestations. As news of the greenskin presence spread, panic would set in among the hive's lower levels. The underhive populations, already living in desperate conditions, would face an enemy they cannot escape from. Some would flee upward, toward the mid-levels, creating refugee crises. Others would try to fight, forming militias armed with whatever they could scavenge. Most would simply die, overwhelmed by Ork raids or caught in the crossfire as Imperial forces attempted to cleanse the contamination. The administratum would face an impossible calculation. How many resources do you commit to cleansing sectors of the underhive that are already partially abandoned? How do you balance the need to eliminate the Ork threat against the countless other demands on Terra's defense forces? What happens when multiple hives report similar infestations, all demanding immediate response? The strategic implications would be profound. Terra could not be allowed to fall to gradual Ork contamination. The symbolic value alone would be devastating to the Imperium's morale. But fighting an endless war of extermination in the planet's depths, while maintaining defenses against external threats, would strain even Terra's vast resources. Some sectors would have to be abandoned entirely, sealed off with massive blast doors and marked as quarantine zones. The populations within would be sacrificed, a brutal calculus that would haunt the decision-makers but would be necessary to prevent the infestation from spreading. Other sectors would be cleansed through fire and chemical weapons, their inhabitants evacuated first if time permitted, killed along with the Orks if it did not. The psychological impact on Terra's population would be severe. The knowledge that greenskins lurk beneath their feet, that the planet itself is contaminated with Xenos filth, would shake faith in the Imperium's ability to protect its holiest world. Cults and radical movements would likely arise, some demanding more aggressive cleansing regardless of cost. Others seeking scapegoats to blame for allowing the contamination to occur. The Inquisition would become deeply involved, not just in coordinating the military response, but in managing the information flow. How much does the general population need to know about the extent of the contamination? How do you prevent panic while still maintaining the vigilance necessary to identify new infestations? These would be delicate decisions with galaxy-spanning implications. Simultaneously, the Adeptus Mechanicus would study the Ork spores with intense interest. Understanding the mechanism of greenskin reproduction has always been a priority for the Magos biologists, but never with samples from a contamination of Terra itself. They would seek ways to neutralize the spores before they could develop, to identify chemical or biological agents that could be deployed on a massive scale. But Ork biology is frustratingly resilient, engineered by the old ones to survive in the harshest environments. Solutions would be slow in coming. Meanwhile, specialized kill teams would wage an endless war in the darkness. These would not be glory seekers or heroes in the traditional sense, but grim professionals who understood that their work would never be finished, never be celebrated, never result in final victory. They would hunt Ork warbands through the underhive tunnels, burning out infestations, sterilizing contaminated sectors, always knowing that somewhere else on the planet, more greenskins were emerging. The defenders of Terra, those forces that stand between the holy world and its enemies, represent the greatest concentration of military power in the Imperium. Understanding who these defenders are and how they would respond to an Ork invasion reveals both the Imperium's tremendous strength and its potential weaknesses. The Adeptus Custodes would form the core of Terra's defense in any serious invasion scenario. These 10,000 Guardians are not merely elite warriors, but living weapons, each one the product of genetic enhancement processes that make Space Marine creation look crude by comparison. Where Space Marines are mass-produced from recruit stock, each custodian is individually crafted, their genetic enhancement taking decades and tailored specifically to their unique physiology. In combat, a custodian operates on a level that seems almost supernatural. Their reaction times are measured in microseconds. They can track dozens of targets simultaneously, predict movements before they occur, adjust their strategy in real time as battlefield conditions change. Their combat doctrine emphasizes individual excellence over unit cohesion. Where Space Marines train to fight as squads, custodians train to be completely self-sufficient, capable of operating alone against overwhelming odds. Against Orks, this difference in approach would be critical. Greenskins fight in massive mobs, relying on weight of numbers and sheer aggression. Traditional military units might be overwhelmed by such tactics, broken apart by the endless pressure. But custodians do not break. A single golden warrior could hold a choke point against hundreds of Orks, his guardian spear moving in patterns too fast for the eye to follow, each stroke precisely calculated to kill or disable. The Custodes are not limited to the palace grounds. In recent times, following the opening of the Great Rift and Reboot Guilliman's return, they have begun deploying beyond Terra in small numbers, forming shield companies that operate across the Imperium. But should Terra face invasion, all available custodians would be recalled, forming a force of unmatched skill and power. Beyond the Custodes, Terra hosts countless other military forces. The Imperial Fists, while no longer maintaining their entire chapter on Terra, as they did before the Horus Heresy, still consider the defense of the Emperor's palace their sacred duty. They maintain a significant presence in the Sol system, and their successor chapters, all children of Rogel Dawn, would rush to Terra's defense should it be threatened. The Grey Knights, based on Titan, would deploy despite their primary mission being demonic threats. While Orks are not demons, the Grey Knights are still Space Marines of exceptional quality, equipped with some of the finest war gear available and trained in combat techniques that make even normal Astartes seem crude. Their presence would add significant combat power to Terra's defense. The Sisters of Battle maintain major convents on Terra, thousands of power-armored warrior nuns whose faith is literal armor against despair. In combat, they bring both martial skill and unshakable conviction, fighting with a fervor that can inspire allies and unnerve enemies. Against Orks, who respect strength and determination, the Sisters would prove particularly effective. Their refusal to yield matching greenskin stubbornness. The Adeptus Arbites, though primarily law enforcers rather than frontline troops, number in the millions on Terra and are equipped with riot gear, shotguns, and suppression shields. In urban warfare, particularly in the confined spaces of hive cities, they would provide valuable support, their training in crowd control and building clearance translating reasonably well to fighting Orks in close quarters. The Inquisition's presence on Terra cannot be overstated. While individual Inquisitors are not necessarily warriors, they command resources, including highly trained stormtroopers, sanctioned psychers, and access to weapons from the Imperium's most restricted arsenals. Some Inquisitors specialize in Xenos threats and have spent lifetimes studying Ork psychology and tactics. Their expertise would be invaluable in coordinating the defense and identifying weaknesses in greenskin strategy. The Officio Assassinorum maintains temples on Terra for each of its major clades. Vindicare snipers could eliminate Ork war bosses from impossible distances, disrupting greenskin command structures. Calidus infiltrators could sow confusion in Ork ranks through deception and misdirection. Eversaw berserkers could be deployed as living weapons into the densest Ork concentrations. Culexus assassins, with their anti-psychic abilities, could potentially disrupt the gestalt field that makes Orks so dangerous in large numbers. But perhaps the most important defenders would be the ones rarely mentioned in tales of heroism: the planetary defense forces, the local militias, the countless ordinary soldiers who would find themselves on the front lines. Terra's PDF is not a ragtag collection of conscripts, but a professional military force equipped with standardized weapons, trained to Imperial Guard standards, or better, and motivated by the knowledge that they defend humanity's birthworld. These soldiers would bear the brunt of the fighting in many sectors, particularly in the hive cities where the custodies cannot be everywhere at once. They would hold the line in narrow streets, establish kill zones in hab blocks, and conduct the grinding work of urban warfare. Their casualties would be horrific, but their determination would be unbreakable. To retreat is to abandon Terra itself, an impossibility for any soldier with faith. The coordination of all these forces would fall to the Terran High Command, a military structure separate from, but working closely with the High Lords of Terra. They would face the nightmare scenario of managing dozens of simultaneous battles across a planet-sized battlefield, allocating forces where they were most needed, deciding which sectors could be reinforced and which must be abandoned. Communication would be both easier and harder than on other worlds. Easier because Terra's communication infrastructure is the most sophisticated in the Imperium, with redundant systems and multiple backup networks. Harder because the sheer volume of information flowing into command centers would be overwhelming, requiring massive staffs just to process reports and issue orders. The battle for Terra would not be a single climactic engagement, but rather thousands of individual battles, each one critical, each one demanding attention and resources. In one sector, custodians might be systematically eliminating an Ork landing force with surgical precision. In another, PDF troops might be locked in brutal street fighting, trading building for building. In a third, civilian refugees might be fleeing before an advancing greenskin horde, with only a thin line of Arbites between them and slaughter. Supply would become a critical concern surprisingly quickly. Even with Terra's vast stockpiles, the sheer scale of combat would drain resources at an alarming rate. Ammunition expenditure in urban warfare is notoriously high, and fighting orcs requires even more as defenders pour fire into greenskin mobs. Medical facilities would overflow with casualties, requiring the establishment of field hospitals in increasingly unsafe locations. The ultimate question would be one of time. How long could Terra sustain this level of combat before critical systems began to fail? The planet's infrastructure, ancient and incredibly complex, requires constant maintenance. Battle damage would accumulate faster than it could be repaired. Power plants would be targeted by orc raiders. Water purification systems would fail under the strain. Food distribution networks would collapse as transportation became impossible in contested zones. Yet through all this, the defenders would fight on, because surrender is inconceivable, retreat is impossible, and defeat would mean the end of everything they believe in. The actual combat between Imperial forces and invading orcs on Terra's surface would be unlike any battle fought elsewhere in the galaxy. The unique nature of the terrain, the significance of what is being defended, and the absolute refusal of either side to yield would create a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. In the hive cities, battles would rage through streets that had stood for millennia, through marketplaces where pilgrims from across the galaxy had once walked in peace, through residential blocks housing millions of souls. The orcs would advance with their characteristic disregard for casualties, rushing forward in mobs that would seem suicidal to any sane observer. They would fire their crude but effective weapons from the hip, shouting and bellowing, each green skin trying to outdo its fellows in displays of violence. Imperial defenders would meet them with disciplined firepower. Laser-gun volleys would light up the streets, thousands of beams converging on orc positions. Heavy bolters would roar, their explosive rounds designed specifically for targets like orcs, each impact tearing massive wounds in greenskin flesh. Autocannons would track orc vehicles, punching through scrap armor that should not protect as well as it does, but somehow manages anyway. The tactical situation in the hives would be infinitely complex. These were not purpose-built fortresses, but living cities, home to billions of civilians who could not simply be evacuated. Commanders would face the nightmare of urban combat, where every building might hide civilians, where every sector cleared could be re-infiltrated from a dozen different approaches, where the three-dimensional nature of hive architecture created countless opportunities for ambush and infiltration. Orc mobs would surge through the lower levels, their natural strength allowing them to smash through obstacles that would stop conventional infantry. They would climb the outside of buildings, their powerful fingers finding purchase on surfaces that seem unclimbable, reaching levels that defenders thought safe from ground assault. They would loot as they advanced, picking up weapons from the fallen, incorporating human equipment into their own arsenals with characteristic pragmatism. The defenders would establish strongpoints at critical junctions, turning intersections into fortified positions, bristling with heavy weapons. They would create layered defenses, multiple fallback positions, allowing for fighting withdrawal when sectors became untenable. They would use the hive's architecture against the attackers, funneling greenskin advances into killing zones where overlapping fire could maximize casualties. Snipers would operate from high positions, picking off orc leaders and specialists. Vindicare assassins, deploying from concealed positions, would engage orc nobs and war bosses with Exitus rounds capable of penetrating even the thickest armor. Each successful elimination would disrupt orc coordination, sowing confusion in the greenskin ranks, though such confusion was always temporary, as another orc simply took command through violence. The orcs would bring their own special terror to the urban battlefield. Storm boys with crude jetpacks would leap between buildings, landing on unsuspecting defenders, bringing chain choppers and sluggers to bear in brutal close combat. Commandos, unusually stealthy for their species, would infiltrate behind Imperial lines, setting ambushes and destroying supply lines. Burner boys with flamer weapons would set entire blocks ablaze, creating infernos that would spread through the densely packed hive levels. Tank warfare in the confined spaces of the hives would be particularly brutal. Ork battle wagons, ramshackle constructions that somehow stayed functional through collective belief, would crash through walls and barricades, their armor thick enough to shrug off laser fire, their weapons capable of devastating entire squads. Imperial tanks, better designed but constrained by the need to preserve infrastructure, would engage from carefully chosen positions, using superior targeting to compensate for the Orks' numerical advantage. At night, the fighting would not stop, but would take on a different character. The Orks, with their inferior night vision, would be at a disadvantage, leading to more cautious advances punctuated by sudden rushes when they detected movement. Imperial forces equipped with night vision equipment and luminators would press their advantage, conducting raids and counterattacks designed to keep the greenskins off balance. The civilian population would become both victims and participants. Those who could not flee would barricade themselves in their hab units, praying that the fighting would pass them by. Some would take up arms, forming militias that varied wildly in effectiveness, from professional PDF troopers forced to operate without support to desperate gangers using this chaos as opportunity for settling old scores. Others would simply try to survive, hiding in whatever shelter they could find, enduring the constant thunder of battle and hoping dawn would bring relief. Artillery would complicate the tactical picture immensely. The defenders possessed it in abundance, from man-portable mortars to massive basilisk platforms capable of reducing buildings to rubble. But using such weapons in populated hive cities required agonizing calculations. How many civilian casualties were acceptable to stop an Ork advance? Which structures could be destroyed without triggering catastrophic collapse of adjacent levels? Every artillery strike required approval from higher command, creating delays that frustrated frontline officers, even as it prevented friendly fire incidents. The Orks, characteristically, had no such concerns. They would fire captured weapons with reckless abandon, often hitting their own troops as frequently as the enemy, seeing such friendly fire as merely another aspect of a good scrap rather than a tactical error to be avoided. Air support would add another dimension to the urban warfare. Imperial Navy pilots flying thunderbolts and lightnings would make strafing runs through the high valleys, engaging Ork positions with autocannon fire and rockets. Ork fighter bombers, crude aircraft held together by rivets and faith, would engage in dogfights that spiraled between hive spires, neither side giving ground willingly. As days became weeks, the battle would develop patterns. Certain sectors would see constant combat as Orks continually attempted breakthroughs while Imperial forces held grimly. Other areas would fall into an uneasy calm as both sides consolidated positions and prepared for the next offensive. The front lines would become fluid and indistinct, with pockets of resistance behind enemy lines and Ork infiltrators operating deep in Imperial-controlled territory. Supply lines would determine victory as much as tactical brilliance. The Imperium, with its organized logistics network, could deliver ammunition, food, medical supplies to frontline troops through established channels. The Orks, trusting to looting and their natural resilience, would scavenge what they needed from the battlefield, creating an asymmetric situation where each side operated according to entirely different logistical principles. The Orks would take horrific casualties, but would not slow down. Their pain tolerance is legendary. Their ability to shrug off wounds that would kill humans almost immediately is frustrating to defenders accustomed to enemies who fall when shot. Orks who should be dead would keep fighting, driven by adrenaline and sheer bloody-mindedness, until catastrophic damage finally shut down their robust biology. Close combat would be inevitable and terrifying. When the Orks closed the distance, when they crashed into Imperial lines with choppers swinging and sluggers blazing, the fighting would become primordial. An Ork stands taller than a man, is stronger than a man, and enjoys fighting far more than any human ever could. Hand-to-hand combat with greenskins is a nightmare that breaks soldiers' spirits, even when their bodies survive. But the Imperium would not face this nightmare unprepared. Where regular troops held the line with ranged weapons, specialized close combat units would meet the Ork charge directly. Space Marines from whatever chapters were available would deploy in their devastating assault pattern, chain blades roaring, combat knives flashing, turning Orks' strength against itself through superior technique and powered armor that amplified already superhuman power. The Sisters of Battle would sing hymns as they fought, their voices rising above the din of battle, their faith sustaining them when muscles trembled and fear threatened to take hold. They would form shield walls where possible, presenting a unified front that even Ork mobs would have difficulty breaking through raw aggression alone. In the Imperial Palace's outer sectors, the fighting would be particularly intense. Every meter of ground would be contested, because every meter closer to the palace's heart is a meter closer to the Emperor himself. The defenses here would layer upon layer, outer walls patrolled by automated weapon systems, minefields that would detonate under Ork weight, bunkers where defenders could pour fire into approaching enemies while remaining protected. The Orks would find creative solutions to these obstacles, solutions that should not work, but somehow do. They would build crude bridges over minefields out of wrecked vehicles and the bodies of their dead. They would charge walls with grappling hooks made from scrap metal and determination. They would combine vehicles into makeshift battering rams and smash through gates that were designed to withstand orbital strikes. Through all this, the custodians would be an unstoppable force. When an Ork breakthrough threatened a critical position, when it seemed that weight of numbers might finally overwhelm skill and preparation, golden warriors would arrive like avenging angels. They would move through Ork ranks with perfect economy of motion, each kill achieved with minimal effort, each movement placing them in optimal position for the next engagement. To watch a custodian fight is to see warfare elevated to an art form. They waste no movement, expend no unnecessary energy. Where a space marine might kill with power and force, a custodian kills with precision and timing. Their guardian spears are not merely weapons, but extensions of their will, moving in patterns that seem almost alive, finding gaps in Ork defenses that should not exist. The Orks, for their part, would love fighting custodians. Here at last were opponents worthy of their respect, enemies who fought with the skill and ferocity that greenskins value. Ork war bosses would seek out the Golden Warriors specifically, viewing combat with them as the ultimate test. These duels would be spectacular and brief. Even the largest, most powerful Ork war boss is outmatched by a custodian, though that fact does not become obvious until the greenskin's head is separated from its shoulders. Air combat would add another dimension to the battle. Ork aircraft, ramshackle assemblies of scrap metal that fly through belief as much as aerodynamics, would clash with Imperial fighters in the skies above Terra. These dogfights would be chaotic affairs, with Orks flying with reckless abandon, pulling maneuvers that would tear apart more carefully engineered craft, surviving through a combination of luck and the Gestalt field's reality-warping effects. Imperial Navy aviators would fly with discipline and precision, using superior technology and training to offset the Orks' natural advantages. They would establish air superiority through coordinated strikes, eliminating Ork aircraft in carefully planned ambushes. But maintaining that superiority would require constant effort, as more Ork flyers kept arriving, drawn by the sounds of aerial combat. The psychological warfare aspect should not be underestimated. For Imperial defenders, particularly those who are not Astartes or Custodes, fighting on Terra itself would bring conflicting emotions. Pride in defending humanity's birthworld would war with terror at what greenskin occupation would mean. Every position surrendered, every meter of sacred ground yielded to Xeno's boots would be a wound to the soul, as well as a tactical setback. For the Orks, Terra represents the ultimate fight, the biggest scrap the galaxy has to offer. They would grow literally stronger from the excitement, their biology responding to the thrill of battle by accelerating growth and healing. War bosses who landed on Terra as merely large would swell to truly massive size over the course of extended combat, becoming walking tanks that require concentrated fire to bring down. The gestalt field would grow stronger with each passing hour, fed by the massive concentration of orcs on a single world. This would have measurable effects on reality itself. Orc weapons would function better, vehicles would run faster, even injuries would heal with improbable speed. The laws of physics would begin to bend toward orc expectations, making them more dangerous the longer the battle continued. Imperial forces would need to counter this through their own advantages: superior organization, better equipment, and the ability to coordinate on a strategic level that orcs simply cannot match. While the greenskins were strong tactically, surging forward with unstoppable momentum, they would lack the overall strategic vision needed to exploit their gains fully. War bosses would compete with each other for glory, rather than supporting each other's advances. Orc mobs would get distracted by particularly appealing targets, rather than maintaining pressure on critical objectives. But even with these weaknesses, even with the defenders' every advantage, the sheer scale of an orc invasion would test Terra's defenses to their absolute limit. At some point, hard decisions would need to be made about what could be saved and what must be sacrificed to preserve the whole. Beyond the immediate military concerns, an orc invasion of Holy Terra would trigger psychological and political shockwaves that would ripple across the entire Imperium. The symbolic value of Terra cannot be overstated. It is not merely the capital world of humanity's empire, but the literal birthplace of the species, the soil from which mankind first reached for the stars. For 1 trillion Imperial citizens who have never and will never set foot on Terra, the planet exists as a religious concept as much as a physical place. It is where the Emperor walked before his enthronement. It is the destination of pilgrims who save for lifetimes to make the journey. It is the ultimate symbol of human achievement, the proof that humanity can endure and thrive despite the hostile galaxy arrayed against it. Should news spread that orcs walk on Terra's surface, that greenskin boots tread the same ground the Emperor once blessed, the psychological impact would be devastating. Faith would be shaken on worlds across the Imperium. If Terra itself can fall under assault, if the holiest site in human space can be violated by Xenos filth, then what hope do remote frontier worlds have? What protection do the prayers and devotions of the faithful actually provide? The ecclesiarchy would face a crisis of monumental proportions. How does the Church explain that the Emperor allowed his own world to be invaded? The usual doctrines about the Emperor testing his faithful, or the need for humanity to prove worthy through struggle, would ring hollow when applied to Terra itself. Cardinals and preachers would need to craft new theological frameworks rapidly, finding ways to maintain faith while acknowledging the terrifying reality. Some among the faithful would interpret the invasion as a sign of divine displeasure, evidence that humanity has strayed from the Emperor's path. Radical cults would arise, demanding ever more extreme displays of devotion, calling for mass pilgrimages to Terra to physically fight alongside the defenders. The Inquisition would need to carefully manage these movements, channeling the fervor productively while preventing it from descending into chaos. Political ramifications would be equally severe. The High Lords of Terra, those 12 rulers who govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, would face scrutiny and blame for allowing the situation to develop. Factions within the Senatorum Imperialis would maneuver for advantage, each claiming they had warned of insufficient defenses or inadequate preparations. Power struggles that normally occurred behind closed doors would intensify, potentially paralyzing decision-making at the exact moment unity was most needed. Sector governors and planetary lords across the Imperium would begin reassessing their own defensive needs. If Terra can be invaded despite its legendary defenses, then surely their own worlds are even more vulnerable. Demands would flood into the administratum for increased military allocations, for more Space Marine chapters to be assigned to their sectors, for permission to raise additional PDF regiments. The bureaucratic machinery would groan under the load of these requests. The Adeptus Mechanicus would see opportunity amid the chaos. Captured Ork technology could be studied, potentially yielding insights that might advance Imperial understanding. The Fabricator General on Mars would likely press for control of this research, arguing that only the Mechanicus has the expertise to safely analyze Xenos artifacts. This would bring them into conflict with other organizations who also want access to the materials. The military implications would extend far beyond Terra itself. Space Marine chapters currently deployed on distant fronts would face agonizing decisions. Should they abandon their campaigns to rush to Terra's defense, potentially allowing critical objectives to fall into enemy hands? Or should they maintain their current missions, trusting that Terra's defenders can hold without reinforcement? These are the kinds of choices that divide chapters and create tensions lasting centuries. Guard regiments would begin diverting toward the Sol system from across the Imperium. Millions of soldiers would be rerouted from their original deployments, cramming into transport ships, all heading toward Terra. But warp travel is unreliable at the best of times. Fleets that left their home systems within days of each other might arrive months or even years apart, if they arrive at all. The Imperium would be gambling that Terra can hold long enough for reinforcements to matter. Economic disruption would begin almost immediately. Terra is not just a symbolic capital, but a functioning hub of interstellar commerce and administration. The administratum, that vast bureaucracy managing the Imperium's affairs, is headquartered on Terra. If its ability to function is compromised by battle damage or simple chaos, then governmental paralysis could spread across human space. The pilgrimage industry, worth incomprehensible sums, would collapse overnight. Pilgrims already en route to Terra would find themselves stranded in transit, their life savings spent on a journey they cannot complete. Some would try to continue anyway, believing that fighting to reach Terra is itself a form of devotion. Others would despair, seeing their dreams destroyed by Xenos barbarism. Morale among Imperial military forces, galaxy-wide, would be deeply affected. Soldiers fighting Tyranids on the eastern fringe, battling chaos in the maelstrom, holding the line against dark Eldar raids. All of them would learn that even Terra is not safe. For some, this would be galvanizing, proof that every battle matters because nowhere is secure. For others, it would be deeply demoralizing, suggesting that all their sacrifices might ultimately be meaningless. The propaganda war would become critical. How much information should be released to the general population? The Imperium has always operated on the principle that citizens need to know only what helps them serve the Emperor more effectively. Too much truth can be as dangerous as too little, creating panic and despair. The Officio Sabbatorum would work overtime crafting messages that acknowledge the crisis while emphasizing the strength of Terra's defenders and the certainty of eventual victory. This messaging would need to be carefully calibrated for different audiences. For worlds near the Sol system, where the truth cannot be completely hidden, the emphasis would be on encouraging additional military recruitment and industrial production to support the war effort. For distant worlds, where news travels slowly and can be more heavily filtered, the invasion might be presented as a brief incursion that was repelled with minimal difficulty, a testament to the Imperium's strength rather than evidence of vulnerability. But rumors cannot be completely controlled, especially across 1 million worlds. The truth would leak out gradually, becoming distorted in the telling. On some worlds, people would hear that Terra has fallen entirely, that the Emperor is dead, that the Imperium has collapsed. On others, the invasion would be dismissed as enemy propaganda, impossible lies designed to undermine faith. The Inquisition would find itself hunting not just heretics, but mere rumor mongers whose wild tales threatened to cause more damage than actual enemy action. Assuming the Imperium successfully repels the Ork invasion, assuming that through sacrifice and determination, the greenskins are eventually driven from Terra's surface or destroyed in place, the aftermath would present challenges almost as daunting as the battle itself. The physical damage would be catastrophic. Hive cities that stood for millennia would be reduced to rubble in sections. The Imperial Palace, that monument to human achievement, would bear scars that might never fully heal. Ancient structures dating back to the Age of Strife, or before, would be lost forever, replaced by crude repairs that lack the original artistry and significance. Rebuilding would require resources on a scale that staggers imagination. The Imperium's economy, already strained by endless wars across 1,000 fronts, would need to prioritize Terra above all other concerns. This would mean pulling resources from other critical areas, weakening defenses elsewhere, potentially allowing enemies to make gains that would have been prevented if materials had been available. The human cost would extend beyond simple casualty figures, though those would be horrific enough. Millions dead, perhaps billions, depending on how extensive the fighting became. But the survivors would bear psychological wounds that might never heal. Soldiers who fought in the defense would suffer from memories of battles that tested them beyond their limits. Civilians who endured greenskin occupation, even briefly, would carry trauma that would echo through generations. The spore contamination would require eternal vigilance. Even with the most aggressive cleansing protocols, even with entire sectors sterilized and vast swaths of underhive sealed permanently, there would always be doubt. Had every spore been eliminated? Were there hidden pockets of orkoid growth that would emerge years or decades hence? Terra would need to maintain dedicated kill teams indefinitely, forces whose sole purpose would be hunting feral orcs through the planet's depths. This would create a new permanent burden on Terra's military establishment. Resources that could be deployed elsewhere would instead be tied down in endless underground warfare. Soldiers would spend careers hunting greenskins through cramped tunnels, fighting an enemy that could never be completely eliminated, knowing their work would continue long after their deaths. The political aftermath would be equally complex. Heads would need to roll, metaphorically, if not literally. The High Lords who presided over the crisis would face demands for accountability. Some would be removed from power, their successors claiming they would never allow such a catastrophe to occur again, though in truth, they would have no more ability to prevent it than their predecessors did. The defensive posture of Terra would need to be completely reconsidered. What weaknesses did the Orks exploit? How did they bypass or overwhelm defenses that were supposed to be impregnable? These questions would need to be answered honestly, which would require admitting failures that some powerful factions would prefer to conceal. The resulting investigations would reveal uncomfortable truths about corruption, incompetence, and wishful thinking in the defensive planning. New fortifications would be constructed, drawing on lessons learned from the battle. But construction on Terra is not like building on empty worlds. Every meter of space is contested, claimed by powerful organizations with ancient rights. Expanding the palace defenses might require demolishing holy sites or forcibly relocating populations who have lived in those locations for generations. These actions would create their own crises and controversies. The relationship between Terra and the rest of the Imperium would fundamentally shift. The planet that once seemed invulnerable would now be recognized as vulnerable, requiring constant protection and support from across human space. This would change the psychological dynamic of the Imperium. Terra would transition from being the strong center that protects its colonies to being a precious treasure that must be guarded by those colonies. Some might see this as poetic justice, a reminder that all parts of the Imperium must work together for survival. Others would resent the increased burden, the resources diverted from their own defense to protect a world that has always claimed supremacy over all others. These tensions could strain the already fragile unity that holds the Imperium together. The Space Marine chapters would need to reassess their role in Terra's defense. Should more chapters maintain permanent garrison on or near the Holy World? Should there be protocols for rapid deployment to Sol System in case of future threats? These questions would revive old debates about the proper role of Astartes forces and their relationship to the central government. For the Orks themselves, ironically, the invasion might be remembered as a glorious success, regardless of the outcome. Greenskin oral traditions would pass down tales of the time they fought on the Big Humi world, the best scrap ever, where the enemies were strong and the fighting was fierce. Future war bosses would hear these stories and dream of achieving similar glory, potentially making another attempt inevitable. The Imperium would need to develop counter-strategies specifically designed to prevent a recurrence. This would mean dedicating intelligence resources to tracking Ork movements, identifying potential threats before they reach critical mass. The Death Watch, those specialized kill teams drawn from many chapters, would likely receive increased authority to conduct preemptive strikes against gathering greenskin hordes. But perhaps the most lasting impact would be psychological. The generation that witnessed Orks on Terra, whether as soldiers or civilians or administrators, would carry that memory forward. They would tell their children, who would tell their children, creating a cultural trauma that would persist for centuries. Terra's invulnerability, once taken for granted, would be recognized as illusionary, a comfortable lie that reality had shattered. This loss of innocence might ultimately make the Imperium stronger. Complacency is a silent killer. If the invasion forces humanity to take threats more seriously, to maintain defenses more diligently, to prepare more thoroughly for the worst possibilities, then perhaps the blood and treasure spent defending Terra would purchase something valuable. Wisdom born of harsh experience. Yet we must acknowledge the possibility that haunts every strategic analysis. What if the defense fails? What if, despite all advantages, despite every sacrifice, the sheer weight of Ork numbers proves too great? What if Terra falls not quickly but slowly, ground down through attrition, sectors falling one by one until the Imperial Palace stands isolated amid a sea of greenskin occupation? The unthinkable becomes thinkable when we consider the full implications of Ork Gestalt field effects on a planetary scale. Billions of greenskins all on one world would create psychic pressure unlike anything the galaxy has seen in living memory. Their collective belief would warp reality more dramatically than anywhere else. Weapons that should not function would operate at peak efficiency. Vehicles that should fall apart would run forever. Orks would grow to sizes that should be biologically impossible, nourished by the psychic energy swirling through the atmosphere itself. Under those conditions, even custodians might find themselves overwhelmed. There are, after all, only 10,000 of them. They can be everywhere simultaneously, only in legend, not in reality. Faced with multiple simultaneous breakthrough attempts, with Orks pouring through breaches faster than defenders can seal them, even golden warriors must make terrible choices about what positions can be held and what must be abandoned. If the Imperial Palace were to actually fall, if greenskins were to enter the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor sits upon the golden throne, the consequences would extend beyond the merely physical. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's will and the sacrifice of thousands of psykers daily, would fail. Without it, warp travel becomes impossible across vast swathes of the galaxy. The Imperium would fragment, sectors cut off from each other, unable to coordinate, unable to support one another. The resulting chaos would make the Horus heresy look organized by comparison. Worlds would find themselves isolated, forced to be self-sufficient in ways they have not been for 10,000 years. Trade would collapse. Communication would fail. Each system would become its own microcosm, sometimes flourishing, but more often descending into anarchy as supply chains broke and no help arrived. Yet even in this darkest timeline, humanity would endure. We are cockroaches, capable of surviving in the cracks and corners when grander things have fallen. Rogue traders would continue to operate, using shorter, more dangerous warp routes. Fortress worlds would hold out for years or decades under siege. Space Marine chapters would become wandering crusades, no longer answering to central authority because no central authority exists. And somewhere, someone would be planning the reconquest. Perhaps Reboot Guilliman, if he survives the fall, rallying loyalist forces for a campaign to retake Terra. Perhaps other forces emerging from the shadows, organizations that have prepared for exactly this catastrophe. The Imperium has survived worse and endured. It would not accept the loss of Terra as permanent, even if reclaiming it took centuries. The Orks, meanwhile, would find that holding Terra is very different from conquering it. Greenskins are excellent at fighting, but terrible at occupation. They have no interest in governance, no capability for administration, no desire to build anything lasting. The planet would become a massive battleground as Ork war bosses turned on each other, fighting for dominance, now that the external enemy is defeated. In this way, even total victory might ultimately prove temporary for the Greenskins. They would render Terra uninhabitable through their constant warfare, destroying what they claim to have conquered. And when they finally departed, seeking new fights on other worlds, leaving behind a devastated husk of what was once humanity's jewel, the Imperium would return. Slowly, painfully, over generations, Terra would be reclaimed and rebuilt. But that rebuilding would create something different from what existed before. The Terra that rose from the ashes would be harder, less trusting, more militarized. The lesson learned would be that safety is illusionary, that eternal vigilance is not merely a slogan, but a survival necessity. Whether this would make the Imperium stronger or merely more brutal is a question without clear answer. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This truth finds its ultimate expression in the possibility we have explored today. The scenario of Orks invading Holy Terra is not merely a thought experiment, but a reminder of the knife edge on which human civilization balances. We have examined how it could happen, what defenses would engage, how the battle would unfold, and what aftermath would follow. The Greenskins represent an existential threat of a unique kind. Unlike Chaos, which offers temptation, or Tyranids, which offer only consumption, the Orks simply want to fight. They are the universe's way of reminding us that sometimes the monsters do not need complex motivations. Sometimes they come because fighting is what they do, because battle is its own reward, because the universe is cruel and random and does not care about our concepts of justice or fair play. Terra's defenses are formidable, perhaps the most formidable in the galaxy, but formidable is not the same as invincible. The War of the Beast proved that even the Holy World can be threatened, that attack moons can hang in Terra's skies, that Ork boots can tread the same ground where the Emperor once walked. What happened once can happen again, and next time the Greenskins might be stronger, more numerous, better organized. Yet, in exploring this nightmare scenario, we also see the Imperium's greatest strength, its refusal to yield. From the Golden Custodians standing eternal vigil to the lowliest PDF trooper manning a barricade in some forgotten hive sector, humanity endures. We take positions that cannot be held and hold them anyway. We face enemies that cannot be defeated and defeat them regardless. We survive because survival is what we do. The story of an Ork invasion of Terra is ultimately the story of the Imperium itself, writ small. Overwhelming threats, impossible odds, brutal sacrifices, and grim determination. Victory purchased with blood, measured in the bodies of the fallen, celebrated only briefly before the next threat emerges. It is not heroic in the way ancient tales portrayed heroism. It is simply the reality of existence in the 41st millennium. If you have enjoyed this deep dive into the horrifying possibility of greenskin boots on holy ground, if you have found value in this exploration of defensive strategy and existential dread, then please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these detailed examinations of Warhammer lore, these journeys into the dark corners of the galaxy where nightmares lurk and faith is tested. The Orks will come again. Perhaps not to Terra, perhaps not tomorrow, but they will come. They always do. And when they arrive, when the Great Crusade begins and billions of greenskins surge forward, seeking the best fight the galaxy can offer, humanity will meet them as we always have, with fire and faith, with courage and contempt, with the knowledge that we may fall, but we will never surrender. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and humanity's answer to that darkness is defiance. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.